What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with another fantasy football stardom and situm video, this time for week number 13 of the 2019 NFL season. You guys know what that means. Just 1 week away from your fantasy football playoffs. And probably some of you have already made it to the playoffs. You're sitting back all comfortable, and you maybe have a bye. Maybe you already know you're in a certain spot, looking at a certain opponent in week number 14. But there are also some of you who are really in need of a victory this week. So for those of you that are in need of a victory, this is the video for you. I'm going to help you with the best starts, the best sits possible this week. Let me know in the comment section below any questions you have about your team, and I will give you the best advice on my opinion on who you should start and who you should sit. I'm not going to be 100% accurate because nobody is, but I will give you my best bet for who to play in your lineup this week. And I hope I've helped most of you make it to the fantasy football playoffs this season. But before I dive into my starts and sits, make sure that you do Gronk spike the like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL and fantasy videos just like this. Let's get right into it with the quarterback position, starting off with Mr. A-Rod, Aaron Rodgers. He plays the New York Giants. Rodgers should see a bounce back week this week. He usually responds well after a big time loss, and getting basically shut out from a fantasy perspective was Aaron Rodgers versus the 49ers. He usually feasts versus teams that are not very good pass rushing teams, and the New York Giants are not one of them. I would start Aaron Rodgers and count on a big time bounce back. You also look at the secondary, and I don't see anybody that can cover Devontae Adams one-on-one consistently. Rodgers should have a big week. Tom Brady, this week versus the Houston Texans, I feel like is going to be a big one for TB12, aka the GOAT. Houston has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. The second least amount of interceptions the Houston Texans have, which means they're likely not taking the ball away from Tom Brady. Well, they also don't have J.J. Watt, so the lack of pass rush is definitely there. Their secondary is one of the weaker ones in the NFL. And finally, Tom Brady will play in decent weather because it's going to be in a dome versus the Texans on the road. And it's likely that Brady has most of his receivers in the lineup this week, so I like Tom Brady. Sam Darnold versus Cincinnati. Sam Darnold has been on such a roll that he's going out, he's partying with consistency. Well, let's hopefully see his consistency come onto the football field once again. And Sam Darnold, he's playing the Bengals. They're allowing the 4th most points per game to the quarterback position, and everybody around him really seems to be clicking right now, whether that's the running game, the passing game, tight end with Griffin, wide receiver with Crowder and Anderson. Adam Gase has it going, so Sam Darnold is a pretty good start once again versus Cincinnati. Jameis Winston versus the Jags. Winston is a roller coaster, but we know when he is great, he is epically amazing. And if you need a win this week and you need a guy to pick up, or if you have Jameis Winston, go for it. He should have a good game this week versus the Jags. Foles versus Tampa Bay. On the flip side, Foles should probably see his best game of the season this week, and I think he will get it going versus Tampa Bay. The Bucs have allowed the 3rd most yards and the 2nd most touchdowns to quarterbacks this season. I would expect Foles to have his best game of the season. My quarterback sits. Jimmy G versus Baltimore. I think that the 49ers will be able to run the ball with some success versus the Ravens, but passing is a different story. The Ravens are a very good defense, specifically as of late and specifically in the secondary. The 4th least amount of fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, and they have more interceptions than they've allowed touchdowns. Phillip Rivers versus Denver. Rivers wasn't great the first time they played the Broncos, and don't expect him to be great this time either. Denver is 5th overall versus quarterbacks, allowing the 4th least amount of yards on the season. Jacoby Brissett versus Tennessee. Brissett is really not electrifying. He's not been explosive this year. Number one, it's just not been enough for me to start him in my lineup. And number two, he hasn't really been efficient enough because he isn't passing enough. And when you're not efficient with those passes, you're not going to get good fantasy production. T.Y. Hilton is also out for this game, which is another reason to sit him down. Tennessee's a middle-of-the-pack defense, but in the first time that Jacoby played them, he failed to even throw for over 200 yards. Baker Mayfield versus Pittsburgh. Mayfield played fairly well versus the Steelers the first time, so I'd understand why you'd want to start him, but this time it's in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's better in Pittsburgh, specifically defensively. They have a new quarterback that I think is a little bit better and will improve them as a whole as a team, and Pittsburgh has allowed the 7th least amount of passing yards and the 2nd most interceptions this season. My running back starts. Let's start off with Darius Geis. If you're in need of a guy to pick up, I think Darius Geis is your guy this week versus Carolina. The Panthers are actually 31st in run defense DVOA this season. They're the 2nd worst run D on average in the NFL. They've allowed 16 rushing touchdowns this season. That's 6 more than any other team. Le'Veon Bell versus Cincinnati. He might have been your first round pick. He might have been an early second round pick. Well, you need to start Le'Veon Bell versus the Bengals this week. They have allowed the third most rushing yards this season. The Jets, I think they should be up in this game in the 4th quarter, which means Le'Veon Bell should see a lot of touches at the end of this game. Ronald Jones plays the Jags, and the Jags have been awful. I don't know if you guys have looked at the stats or watched the games, but the Jags have been awful versus the run lately. They rank dead last in run DVOA and are the worst team over the last 3 games versus the run. Miles Sanders versus Miami. Miami has allowed the most rushing yards this season to opponents, nearly 100 more yards than any other team. James White versus Houston. I told you to start him last week. This was one of the areas where I was wrong. I didn't expect the monsoon to hit in New England quite the way it did. I expected him to get more receptions out of the backfield. This week, I think the Patriots will go back to their running backs. They're playing Houston, who has allowed the most receptions to the position, and James White is one of the best receivers at this position. It only makes sense for him to have a big week. Also, they've had running backs perform very well in the passing game versus Houston in the past. Running back sits. Joe Mixon versus the Jets. The Jets have the best run defense in the NFL, allowing only 78 yards per game on the ground. David Johnson versus the Rams. He has stunk, and he has been a major disappointment all year, but it's only getting worse. He's only played 21% of the Cardinals' snaps since Week 7. Carlos Hyde versus New England. No defense in the league has allowed fewer touchdowns to the running back position, only 1. And also fewer fantasy points to the running back position, 14.6 per game. New England is not letting any running back go off. And then you have Jalen Samuels versus Cleveland. I just don't know who's going to get the ball for Pittsburgh. I don't see this as a high-scoring game, so I don't really see the upside here playing Samuels. Wide receiver starts Jamison Crowder to go along with Sam Darnold and Le'Veon Bell. He plays the Bengals. The Bengals have given up 7 touchdowns to the slot receiver, an average of 7.6 catches per game, and the 5th most fantasy points to the slot receiver, which Jamison Crowder is. When he's clicking, he can be a nice upside play for you. DJ Chark versus Tampa Bay. Talk about upside. Well, this week, Chark plays the Bucs, who have allowed the most receiving yards and touchdowns to the wide receiver position this year. Mohamed Sanu plays Houston. The Texans have allowed the 3rd most receiving touchdowns on the season and rank 26th in pass defense DVOA. Nelson Aguilar plays in Miami Dolphins. Aguilar is a slot guy. Miami is the worst team, or one of the worst teams, versus the slot position. I think if any Eagles player / receiver has a good game, it would be Nelson Aguilar. So if you're in real need of picking up a receiver, I would not mind streaming Nelson Aguilar. And the last one is Boyd. Dalton is back, and the Jets have allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver, also the 2nd most touchdowns. Wide receiver sits. Marquise Brown versus San Francisco. San Fran is playing at a historic level in pass defense. They are actually 1st in passing yards allowed, which I think right now is on pace to be the greatest ever. They've also allowed the 2nd least amount of yards to the wide receiver position this year. Will Fuller versus New England. New England has allowed a grand total of 1 touchdown in 11 games this year to the wide receiver position, and just 12.2 fantasy points per game in PPR versus all receivers. That's incredible. Will Fuller, I would expect him to see the double team while you have Stephon Gilmore on DeAndre Hopkins. I don't love the big play potential of Will Fuller this week. I would go somewhere else. Mike Williams versus Denver. Williams is just not seeing a lot of targets, and really the upside isn't there with Phillip Rivers not having the same deep ball he used to. The Broncos are also a very good defense versus the pass. They have allowed the 5th least amount of yards and receptions to wide receivers this season. And you have Kirk of the Cardinals versus the Rams. I expect Jalen Ramsey to mostly be shadowing him, so I would shy away from him and go somewhere else. My tight end starts to finish off week 13. Greg Olsen versus Washington. With 7 targets in each of the last 4 games, Olsen has become a viable tight end 1 or a back end tight end 1. I would start him this week for a reliable floor. And then you have Doyle versus Tennessee. With Eric Ebron out, Doyle pretty much is the number 1 receiver now. T.Y. Hilton's also out. So for at least this game versus Tennessee, Doyle could see a lot more looks than typically. Then you have Griffin of the Jets versus Cincinnati. And he's played really well. I mean, I have nothing else really great to say about him. He's just played really well. He has become a major component of this offense. Cincinnati is not a very good defense. In a game that the Jets should win, I could see Griffin adding another touchdown to his total with the Jets. And then lastly, Everett versus Arizona. Arizona is ludicrously awful versus the tight end position. They've allowed 12 touchdowns to the tight end position this year. That's 4 more than the second most. Those are my starts. Those are my sits for week number 13 of the 2019 fantasy season. Again, leave your comments below. Leave your questions below. It's been Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Peace.